Hello, everybody. So thank you so much for that introduction. I am Rebecca, and I'm going to be talking to you guys about the Loomis Method, which is a really useful way to start a portrait. I do a lot of portraits. The Loomis Method is something that I started incorporating into my teaching fairly recently, and I've just really enjoyed it as a teaching tool. It's really, really useful. It's super easy to use once you kind of get it figured out, and it becomes a little more natural and intuitive. So my plan for today is I'm going to walk you guys through the method, kind of front, profile, and then we're going to talk about how it works from different angles and how we can apply it to like photos and stuff like that when we want to actually get a likeness. So I'm just going to jump right in. And the first, I'm also, by the way, I'm using ProCreate right now, so I can do this digitally. It just makes it a little easier for me to show you guys what I'm doing really clearly. But this obviously can be done with any type of material. It doesn't really matter what you're using or whether you're drawing or painting. This is a great foundation. So with that, now I'll start. So the first thing we want to do when we're working with the Loomis Method is to start with a circle. And if you're drawing with pencil and paper, you may want to use a compass or something, unless you're pretty good at drawing circles. Either way, it doesn't matter. You can also, grid paper is helpful for this too, if you really want to be super precise and measure out the squares. So we start with a circle, and the first step is very simple. We're just going to divide the circle into quarters with a center line and another center line. Now these two lines, when we're looking at the face directly on, this is what we're going to see, is this kind of just simple division. But in reality, what these two lines are doing is they're following the center line of the face and the brow line. So this is the brow line, and this would be the center line, which means that depending on the angle of the face, those two lines are going to move. So if I were doing, a portrait from like a 3/4 angle, and again, we'll talk more about angles kind of farther in, it might look something like this because it's rotating around. If I'm seeing someone from, kind of a wonky angle like this way, we might see, we're going to see curves on those lines if we are kind of viewing it from different angles. But when we're just straight ahead, it's going to be straight lines both directions. The next step is we're going to kind of visualize taking a knife and just slicing the sides off this sphere. So we're imagining it not just as a circle, but as a full sphere. And we're going to make these slices at kind of a slight angle, meaning that we're going to see some of the back of the head as well as the front. So we want that to be kind of even. It's going to look like an ellipse. That one might be a little too far in. Let me adjust it. Just do a quick little undo. Okay, so the shape that we're cutting off of the circle is basically kind of like a contact or like a little wedge. So we would be slicing like this, and then what you've sliced off is like a little side of the circle there, if that makes sense. And we're going to do that on both sides. Now, if you are being very precise in measuring, the idea is that this circle, because if you were looking at it in profile, directly from the side, this would just be a circle inside your circle, that this circle be approximately about 2/3 the size of the initial sphere or circle that you're working with. I usually eyeball it, and depending, it's also kind of a variable function because everybody's head is unique. So the closer in that you shave these sides, if you really push it in, it's going to make the face longer and narrower. If you leave them a little bit farther out and cut off a little bit less, it's going to make the face shorter and rounder. So there is kind of a limit in both directions as to what looks natural, but depending on the type of head you're going to draw, sometimes I intentionally vary that a little bit to kind of give me some variance in the type of face I want to draw, or depending on what I'm looking at if I'm working from a reference photo. Once we have all these initial lines, we've kind of imagined that we've sliced the sides off. So these now are side planes, and we can erase this extra bit over here on the side. Then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to connect the tops and the bottoms of these two sliced planes and create this little grid of squares. And if we measure these squares, ideally they should be about the same height. If we did it right, they should, if we're looking straight ahead, it should be about the same height. And then if we measure down one more of those equal measurements, that's where we're going to locate the bottom of the chin. So let me just do a quick little measuring for ProCreate. I'm going to actually use this line to move it down and measure that way, using a new layer to make sure that I get exactly the right measurement. Okay. So once we have that, then essentially we have all of the initial building blocks. We can connect this bottom portion by dropping a sort of, egg shape, like the top of an egg sort of shape here for the jaw. I like to keep it a little softer. We don't want to go like super angular necessarily. You can, but I like to keep it a little softer, a little rounder. And we could also pull down the neck, kind of following a similar line there, and add in some shoulders. Okay, so last thing before we start placing features is going to be from this point where the brow line meets the side of that circle on both sides of the head. We're going to drop a little kind of slightly curved line from there to the sort of corner of the chin. So if you imagine the chin having kind of like two sides before it sort of flattens off at the bottom, we're going to connect those using this line here on both sides. And again, that kind of shows us the side plane of the face here. Like it shows us that break where we go from front to side. So once we have this sort of structure, it looks kind of like a, like a mannequin head at this point. We can kind of start to visualize the dimensionality of it, the fact that it, wraps around, goes physically into the third dimension. Now we can start using these lines to measure out approximately where the features are going to go. Now, this is another moment where every face is unique, so everybody's features are going to be a little bit different. They might be placed slightly in, higher, lower. Maybe one person has a really large nose and one person has a really short nose. There's beautiful variety in people. But this is a really great kind of framework because it gets you close. Most of those variations that happen with faces are really relatively very small. They're not going to be like, one person's brow is going to be up here and another's going to be down here. It might be that, the brow moves a little bit one way or the other, but it's going to be fairly subtle. Expression also plays a role in this. But again, when we're just kind of talking about standard proportions, this is a really excellent way to get started and make sure that you're on track. So as we mentioned, this line that's kind of in the middle of the head is the brow line, which really means that like the tops of the eye sockets are kind of along that line. The brow itself, again, depending on expression, if you're really surprised, maybe it comes up a little bit more. If you're really angry and, it's kind of furrowed, it might move down a little more. But I like to kind of visualize the whole eye socket before I put in the eyes anyway, because it kind of helps to kind of situate it in the head to understand the structure of what's going on. I'm really big on structure, kind of having at least a sense for the underlying structure, the skull and where everything is, the anatomy behind things. I have these little visual aids that I use sometimes that I send to my students who buy the course. And I sometimes throw them on accident. Sorry, guys. I also use a tennis ball, which you can wrap rubber bands around. And this is really helpful for kind of visualizing how turning the head can affect that center line. And if you want to put two rubber bands around it both ways, you can see both lines at the same time. So it's just a little helpful trick there. Okay, so we have kind of the eye sockets here, and the eye is going to be approximately 1/5 of the width of the head. So if you want to more carefully measure that, you can, but that's always basically, that's how you would check yourself, is you want to kind of put an eye in between, say, okay, maybe these need to be a smidge bigger or a smidge smaller, and then an eye on either side. And you want those all to be about the same size. That's how you're going to be able to tell whether your eyes are too big or too small. The nose usually ends where it meets the actual face, right on this, this next line that connects the bottoms of the two ovals that we made, or the two slices. That's going to be where the nose is located. The mouth is usually slightly higher than halfway between the bottom of the nose and the chin. So this is kind of the mark for the center of the mouth. And again, once we kind of have these landmarks, it makes it a whole lot easier to fill in the rest. The hairline is this top one. So here where the top two slices connect, we have the hairline. And again, where the bottom two connect, we have the nose line. The ears are located between the brow line and the nose. So we can kind of place at least little placeholders here for where the ears are going to go. Once we have all of the basic building blocks in place, oh, let me catch you some widths as well here. I do all the vertical things and then I forget about the other ones. So between the eyes, sometimes approximately the distance of the space between the eyes, or sometimes slightly narrower or wider, is the width of the nose. The width of the mouth can be found by dropping a line down from the center of each eyeball. That's how you find the corners of the mouth. And everything else is going to kind of depend on expression and on the type of face and the type of features that you're working with. All right, so my husband just came and handed me back this skull. So he's a little mangled from his fall, but he's back with us. Thank you. All right, he's got kind of a wonky jaw. We'll have to figure that out later. All right. So the next step is we're going to start filling in these features with a little bit of detail. Again, right now we're just kind of working generally, so we're just going to make it up as we go along. If you're working from a reference photo, obviously we're going to be referring heavily to that, but for the time being, we're just going to kind of sketch in something loosely. So we could sketch in the eyes. Again, if we've kind of used these like circles or ovals as placeholders, they kind of help us to visualize the shape of the eyeball, which again, if we go back to like the structure underneath what we're drawing, it's really helpful to always be thinking about the full structure, not just the visible structure that we're seeing, because sometimes understanding the function really helps us to make sense of the form. So we can kind of sketch in the more specific shape of the eye. You know, maybe there's the eyelid over the top of it. We also really want to pay attention to making sure that things are symmetrical, at least mostly so. Most people's faces are pretty symmetrical. Put that in. We could add some information for the eyebrow, you know, how this is a very expressive feature. So how we place the eyebrows, how big they are, how they're kind of bending, that's all very expressive. The nose, again, this line is marking sort of like where it actually meets the face. So depending on the shape of the nose, some noses, you know, kind of like turn down and then like may go back up a little bit before they become a nostril. Other noses are like really turned up. So sometimes we may see like the ball of the nose above that nose line, and sometimes it'll be either right on the nose line or even a little bit below it, depending on the angle of the head. So again, we'll get to angles in a little bit. So we could place, you know, maybe the ball of the nose, maybe get some information for the nostrils, put in a little mark for the philtrum, and just place a center line for the mouth, and then maybe decide how we want to draw in some lips. And top of the chin, we can kind of think about the chin as sort of like a little box or shape here that's kind of like stuck onto the front of the jaw, because it is a little bit independent. So these lines sometimes kind of bracket like the sides of the chin there, which sometimes you can see and differentiate those a little bit from the rest of the jaw. And then if we wanted to add in some hair or something, we could. Hair often goes above the ball. So if you're drawing someone with like a big hairdo or something, you have to account for that a little bit. Okay, so that's basically the front view. And it's, again, it's like, it seems like a lot, but once you've done it a couple of times, it's really easy to follow. So next, what I want to do is demo kind of the same thing from profile. We're just going to see how it turns. So starting the same way, we start with a circle. And in direct profile, let me make this a little bigger. In direct profile, we're going to start the exact same way. So we're going to divide the circle into even quarters. And if you want to, really make sure you get it right, you can use a ruler or something or grid paper to really divide that evenly, but sometimes I just eyeball it. All right. And then the equivalent of slicing the sides, like I mentioned earlier, if you're looking at it in profile, that's just going to look like a circle. You're just slicing, shaving a bit off the side that's facing us. So I'm just going to add another circle here and adjust the size since I can adjust it. If you're doing this, again, kind of in traditional media using a pencil, you might kind of want to like mark out the distances a little bit. And again, it doesn't have to be precisely perfect, but approximately 2/3 the size of the original circle is what you're aiming for. Once you have that, then just like before, we're going to basically imagine that we're drawing a line that's going to wrap all the way around and connect the two sides that we just sliced off. So these lines will be perpendicular or parallel to the brow line, whatever direction the head is facing. So if the head is in profile, but it's looking up, these are all going to rotate. This is going to follow the angle of the head. They could be looking down and we would rotate it that way. If they're looking pretty much straight ahead, we're just going to see it straight ahead like this. And just like before, we're going to measure this out one more time. Hopefully that's about the same distance. And then we measure down one more to get the bottom of the face. So this is where the chin should be. And we can just create a sort of sweeping line down to the chin. Now, profiles are a lot of fun because this is another area where you can really kind of vary it up. A lot of people are going to have different, like some people have a more prominent brow and a more receded jaw. Some people have the reverse. Their jaw comes forward, their forehead's a little farther back. So this shape can really depend on who you're drawing or what type of face you want to draw if you're just kind of making it up as you go along. So, it might sweep forward more. It might kind of come like straight down more. There's a lot of different things and you can kind of play around with what it changes about a face when you move that around a little bit. I'm going to connect these lines so we can really see, and we'll connect the jaw kind of right around this center line. So remember, the ear is basically between the nose and the brow line, and it's usually kind of right behind this center axis of the head. And the back of the head, sometimes, like if we look at our skull again, the back of the head is actually a little bit higher than the sphere might be. So sometimes I kind of imagine slicing that up just a little bit to create the shape of the back of the head. I added a neck. All right, so now it's basically just creating, we can add our kind of side plane line here as well. And now we have our mannequin head, we can start adding features. So from profile, most people are gonna have kind of an indentation here as the head moves from brow to bridge of nose. The nose will come out at some angle, depending on the shape of the nose. And back in, have a nostril or something over here. The mouth, and again, this is one of those variables. Some people might have, a really prominent mouth. It might be more prominent on the upper lip, less prominent on the lower lip, or vice versa. Other people kind of have, it comes down straighter here. It might be smaller, maybe a bigger chin. There's lots of different shapes that we can achieve here with just small variations. So just pick one and put it in. And with just a simple connecting line there, we can establish a believable sketch of a mouth. Now for the eyebrows, they're usually going to end approximately at this intersection. And the eye from profile, we're mostly just going to see as a sort of triangle shape. So we might see a triangle like this. We're going to see the eyeball we're usually seeing more of the lower portion of the eyeball is actually what's revealed in our eyes. So if we're looking at an eye and the eyelids like we're seeing more of the lower portion than of the top portion. So what that means is that in profile, we're really seeing kind of like this curve instead of this curve. Now, obviously, that's can be changeable also. All of this is really changeable. So if the person's looking really far up, that's going to make it have an effect as well. And there's a bulge on the front of the eyeball that is the lens of the eye. So, really it would be like a sphere with a little bit of a bulge on the front. So depending on where the gaze is looking, you can kind of direct it that way as well. And the eye will also generally meet up, the corner of the eye will probably meet up with this line in profile. So I think the mouth feels a little too low to me just because of, we moved that around a couple of times. I'm going to nudge it up because it feels a little more natural. Okay, and then just like before, we would add in some hair or whatever we were going to add to kind of give it the finished look, the character that we're going for. So the cool thing about the Loomis method is that it doesn't just work for the front and profile views. It does really easily follow any angle of the head, and it really helps to make sense of some really complicated and difficult angles like 3/4 view, or even like when the head is tilted up or down. It's really a useful tool for those sort of complex tasks. So I'm going to do one kind of demo of just the Loomis method with no reference. And then I'm going to start pulling up some references, and I'm basically going to just kind of walk through the process of trying to get a likeness using the Loomis method. So once again, even in 3/4 view, we're going to start with a circle. And now we can use our tennis ball to help us if we want to, because we want to figure out, okay, what angle do we want the head to be facing? And we can decide on whatever angle we want. It can be like a turned and tilted angle, but we're going to start with kind of a simple 3/4 view for now. And we're going to imagine that what we're drawing is that rubber band kind of turning around the tennis ball. And if the head is fairly level at an angle, then we're still going to see the center line, the brow line, as pretty much a straight line. This line will only curve when the head is kind of tilted one way up or down, which again, you can use this to kind of visualize for yourself. So hold it straight and see how, that even though the head might be turned, we can use that Wilson to kind of help indicate the turn of the center line. But if I tilt it up or down enough, I'm going to start seeing the curve on this line as well. So again, this is just a really useful little visual aid for kind of making sense of the three-dimensionality of this shape. So once we have our two center lines, we're going to slice the side off the circle. In 3/4 view, that's sometimes depending on how far the head is turned, you're going to see more or less of the ellipse. So it's either going to be like a really narrow slice, kind of a narrow ellipse if the head is turned more towards you, and it's going to be much wider, maybe close to circular if the head is turned really far. So it's almost in profile. But the line should basically match or follow the curve of your center line. Like we really want to pay attention to that, make sure that it's making sense, that it's all kind of fitting together in a logical way. And we're probably going to see a slight cut off the other side. So it's pretty simple, pretty tight there, depending on, again, kind of how far the head is turned. You kind of have to use your imagination a little bit to visualize how much of it might be sliced off over there. And I think this needs to come down a little more because I'm noticing that my midline is not exactly in the middle of this shape. And sometimes, depending on the angle, we have to straighten out this line. So if that was curved one way or another, when you shave off the side like that, you're basically creating a flat plane. So that line isn't going to curve anymore. You want to connect it straight from this point to wherever that rubber band would be hitting on the back. So you want to connect it that way. And then I like to also drop a vertical line through this circle to help me out too. So we've got this kind of cross section. Now, again, these two lines are basically, they should always be perpendicular to one another. You have to be able to imagine that, like, if you were looking straight at them, they would be like a circle in 4 even parts. So right now this looks like the top portion is maybe a little bit taller than the bottom portion, but I'm going to let it slide because it's close. And then in 3/4 view, this is another really helpful thing to remember, is whatever angle this line is, I like to put a little bit of a line at the top and bottom that match that angle. So if that angle were like this, then the lines at the top and the bottom would also be like that. If it were aiming down, same thing, the lines at the top and bottom would go the same way, because what that's going to do is it's going to help you guide this line around the ball as if it's another sort of rubber band that's being wrapped around. And then just like normal, we measure out our segments, place a mark for the chin. And now what we're going to do is we're kind of going to drop a line from this center intersection, which is basically right here. And if you'll notice, if I look in profile, like basically you've got like the curve of the forehead, and then it's just going to drop kind of, it might go forward or back a little bit, but to get us started, we just kind of drop that. So it stops curving around the ball and begins to fall straight down from that point or close to it. Then we're going to add in like a side plane of the face over there. We're going to come down with the jaw, again, just behind this line or just in front of that line there. Connect it. And our kind of side plane indicator there. We probably won't see it on this side. If we do, it's going to be very close to that outer edge. Let me get rid of these little lines over here. All right, so once again, we kind of have our mannequin head, our building blocks. We can add in a neck if we want to. And now we can start kind of building in the features. So we're going to imagine the eye sockets once again. And on this side, we're going to see how, the challenge of 3/4 view is that we're often seeing the far side features in kind of, limbo between profile and front facing. So for instance, like the shape of the eye and the nose, it's like, it's not quite one or the other. It's somewhere in between, depending on how far the head is turned. We're also going to see this sort of indentation for we're going to see the brow bone possibly poke out a little bit. The cheekbone might poke out a little bit. The chin might kind of come forward a little bit. So we can start kind of finessing those shapes based on, especially if we have a reference, we're going to look to the reference to tell us how to finesse those shapes. We have the bottom of the nose here, and we know the mouth is going to be a little higher than halfway between the nose and the chin, so somewhere in that vicinity. And we can place some ovals or some circles for the eyeballs. You might not see all of the eyeball on this side. It might kind of tuck behind the nose a little bit. And like I said, this line for the nose is really where it connects with the face. So don't be afraid to kind of play around with where the ball of the nose needs to be. If it's going to be a little higher, a little lower, kind of right on the line. But it gets you in the ballpark pretty easily, pretty quickly. And sketch in a little more for the eyebrows. Maybe add in the shape of the eyes. The mouth might come forward a little bit. So this is another opportunity to kind of take a look. You can check this on your reference if you're drawing from a reference by kind of checking the center line, you can follow it through the nose and see, like, sometimes it'll drop a little bit farther out this way when it comes down through the mouth. Other times it will kind of go back closer to the original center line. But be aware that that may move. The center of the mouth might be farther toward the direction of the turn of the head than the center line indicates. So we can check that. And we're still going to use kind of a halfway from the eye mark. That's still the measurement for the width of the mouth. And what that means is if the center moves toward the direction of the turn, you'll see more of the lip on the side that's, facing you more directly than you will on the opposite side. So you may see it, something like this, with more of the lip on this side and less on this side. And then the ears, before we forget, sometimes I forget ears. Place them again, kind of behind that center line of the side plane of the head. And here's the hairline, so we could add some hair. Just, whatever we want the hair to look like, just to get us started there. So that's how it works in 3/4 view. So before I go on, I'm going to pause here and I have chat open. Do you guys have any questions so far that you want me to kind of go back, explain anything again, go a little slower, anything like that? Let me know in the chat, and I will absolutely do that. And in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and pull up our first reference. And we'll go ahead and start here. I don't see any questions so far. Feel free to ask them if you have them. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep rolling. So this is an example of, a pretty straightforward turn of the head. I think she does have maybe a slight tilt. And the way we're going to look for that, just to see what we're dealing with, is we can look at the line between the brows, like from one brow to the other, to kind of see how straight is that line. Is it angling a little? Is it straight? What's going on there? And we can also look at the angle from the top of the ear to the brows. And her brows are a little bit raised, so this might be slightly biased. We could maybe kind of try to mentally visualize where the top of the eye socket is, which might be a tiny bit lower, but it's not going to change the angle dramatically. But this angle, the fact that it's not perfectly horizontal, tells us that there's probably a little bit of tilt there. So we can use that as we're constructing the Loomis method over there. So we can check for that. And then we're just going to go ahead and start with our circle. It doesn't really matter how big the circle is. It's obviously going to affect how big your drawing is, but it doesn't have to be a one-to-one size comparison. I'm sure you guys know how to, scale things up and down, but so size doesn't really matter as long as you keep it consistent within your own drawing. So once you have your circle, we're going to look for the center line of the face. And this is another opportunity where you can really study your reference if you have it, printed out or on a computer or anything that you can kind of sketch over it. You could do a little kind of draw through, just mentally going down the center of the face and taking a look at what that line looks like. Is there a significant difference between, like, if I were to draw a line down the middle, just a straight line, like how's that connect to the different pieces? So this is kind of informing us like what that curve should look like, as well as, maybe like how far over on the circle to put it and where we're going to drop the center line for the mouth. All that stuff is just kind of a get familiar with it sort of step. Once we're comfortable, we're going to go ahead and put in center line over here. One that feels like it matches that. And like I said, we kind of can tell that there's like a little bit of a tilt, like her chin might be raised just a little bit. So what that means is that the the brow line is going to be a little bit curved, maybe just slightly. And I'm going to kind of take the time to make sure that that feels right, feels logical, as if it's, you know, you can even check yourself with your tennis ball. And then we're going to slice the side. And for this, we're going to look at kind of the distance between, because basically the side slice is usually connecting somewhere about right here on the face. So we're kind of seeing, like, you can see where the face, that we have like the front of the face here, and then it sort of turns. And so somewhere in that vicinity, the vicinity of that turn is where we want the side of the slice to be. So we want to sort of take a look at that and use that to help guide like how far over one way or the other we want to place that line. I'm going to put it about right here, I think. And again, we want to follow the curve of the center line. And then we'll flatten out this line. Might need to be a little bit more of an angle, so we can adjust it if we need to. And then a perpendicular line down the center of that slice. Probably also going to see a little bit sliced off the far side. And then we can get rid of the extra lines. Okay, so now's the part where we're going to add the lines to connect the two slices. But again, we really want to make sure that those lines are following the curve of this line, that they're wrapping around the ball in a logical way that like makes sense for the form. So what I like to do is to sketch in a little bit of this line here and here. Again, just making sure that those are parallel to the center line here. And once you're happy with that, you're going to wrap it around the ball. Like so. And then we'll measure them out. And one more down. And we need to get rid of our little measuring lines. Then we'll drop down the side of the face and the jaw. And our little kind of side plane line. Now the side plane line can, it can be different for different people. It's going to kind of depend on the shape of their face. So some people, you know, it kind of might bend a little more like this. You might want to try to like follow the contour of the cheekbone. You know, it's a useful mark, mostly because it helps us to visualize the three-dimensionality of the form. So there's not like a hard and fast right and wrong there. You can kind of play with it to see how it feels and how it works for you. All right, so we observed that her eyebrows were a little bit raised, so we might want to put them kind of just above the brow line. We're also going to kind of take a look at the outer contour of the face. We know it's probably going to come in here under the, like around the eye. And it's probably going to come back out again for the cheekbone. And then go back in. And it might go more than we have it. It might go less. And we might need to adjust it again as we draw. But again, this is kind of setting yourself up for success. And, you know, once you get quick at this, it happens much more quickly than if you try to just dive into a drawing and make a guess. Then you're spending a lot of time doing a lot of corrections to get believable proportions. All right, we could also kind of follow this center line down. All right, so we know that the bottom of the nose is going to be approximately there. The middle of the mouth is going to be approximately here. And now we're going to be kind of observant. We're going to look at our photo for direction here to help get the, the shape of the nose more or less, at least similar to our reference. And the eyes, again, we're going to look for kind of the shape. So I can see the shape of the eye socket kind of loosely in the contours of the face. So if I were to guess, I would say that's the eye socket right there. And so again, if that's helpful, which I think sometimes it is, because it gives you a little bit more of a reference point to kind of frame up where everything should be. So you could kind of sketch that in, and that tells me, oh, look, I was about to draw the eye a little bit too far in. It probably would have been too close to the nose. So I can move it out a little bit. And that's going to help me inform the far eye as well, because obviously they're going to be in line with one another. And from the middle of the eyes on both sides, we'll be able to find approximately the corners of the mouth. We have the hairline, which is probably going to be right up where it should be. And we could start sketching in kind of where the actual hairline comes down on the face. We're going to pay attention to how much space is between the eyebrow and the hairline there to help inform that. And add in the ear. And now we'll kind of start going through and adding a little bit of information. So we're going to, again, at this point, we're not just guessing anymore. We're not making anything up. So we're looking to the reference for, the shapes and the locations of everything from this point on. And sometimes that means doing a little bit of adjusting. Sometimes it's a little bit off. The benefit of using the formula is that at least, even if it's not perfect, it usually doesn't look totally like an alien from the beginning. So it's a great place to kind of start and get things at least believable, and then move them around from there if you need to make some adjustments. Sketch in the philtrum. Again, we're going to look for the center of the mouth. I think I'm going to move that up a little because it feels a little bit low when I'm looking at the space between her lip and her nose. It's not that much space. So this is an opportunity to kind of check that and make some adjustments. We look for the angle of the line between the lips to help us with that. I think the whole cheek probably needs to come in a little bit, and the chin may need to come up a little bit too. I'm always sketching just kind of some shapes for any shadows or anything that I might need to know for painting it, or whatever it is that I'm going to do with the drawing as I continue. And of course we have the hair. It's got this long braid, so I would just start it with a simple shape and develop it later. And now that we have a more kind of complete image, we can see where all the parts are. We can see where things might be off and maybe need a little bit of adjusting. So if you're working on paper, lightly erasing over this, or by kind of just drawing over it, you could also sketch this in with a very hard pencil so that it's very light. What I'm going to do in ProCreate is I'm just going to lower the opacity of this layer and start again. Again, when you're first doing this, it's very common to kind of be a little heavy-handed with all the marks, and you end up with a lot to erase or to deal with if you're trying to take it onto a finished product. So tracing onto like a light board onto another page might be a good option. But once you kind of get familiar with it, you can use, a really light pencil, just kind of sketch it in quickly and then go over it and build on top of this. So we're just going to check as we go around. We're looking now to compare everything we have with the reference. There's a lot of shadows on this side, so there is going to be some ambiguity. And whenever there's ambiguity, you just you put down the best line you can come up with, and you know that as you develop the drawing, you're going to put that shadow there, and you could even sketch out the shape of the shadow instead of trying to identify exactly the shape of the feature that's lost. And you just clean up the sketch a little bit this way. Okay, but I'm not going to go too crazy with this one because I do want to show you guys some other angles, things like that. So I'm just going to do a real quick little, just really quickly make a couple of adjustments, and then we'll move on. I'll leave it there for now because we can see her face a little more clearly. All right, so let's pick a new picture and move this one out of the way. Check out this guy here. This guy has a little more expression in his face. He's also got a little more complicated head tilt. So this is a great opportunity to kind of talk about the versatility of this method, because this kind of like subtle tilt and turn can be a very challenging angle. But we'll be able to tackle it, I think, without too much trouble with the help of our handy Loomis method. So we start with a circle as usual. And before we put in our center line, this is another opportunity to kind of check on the photo. Let's take a look where this line, let me get a brighter color. If we draw a center line down his face, what's the angle of that line? If we draw one across the brows, and then we have to kind of imagine where the top of his ear is, but if we connect those two, that also helps kind of define the angle that we need to achieve in our sketch over here. So those are the two things that are really useful, because they're the lines we're going for, and they're easy to see on the portrait. So connect ear to eyebrow, eyebrow to eyebrow, and then center down the face. And once we have those measurements, or at least have checked in with them to kind of see what they look like, what the angles look like, we can try to replicate that on our circle. So we're going to visualize the ball with the rubber band wrapping around it at the same angle. And then for the eyebrows, should be something along these lines. Then when we slice off the side, again, we're going to we know that the slice is approximately here. So it's going to be a fairly narrow slice, because if we're looking at that shape on his head, it's not super wide. We can only see a little bit of it. So we're going to see this as a pretty narrow ellipse. And we're also going to imagine now that we're slicing this as a straight line, and it's going to go back to where it would connect on the other side of the circle. And we'll slice a little bit off this side as well. And then we'll use the same angles. We'll find our kind of parallel marks, follow those around the ball. And if it helps you, you could even kind of like turn these into ellipses, because basically, we're slicing this one, but we're doing the same thing on the top and the bottom. We're just not actually cutting that part off. We're leaving the roundness under there. Same up here. So this line may follow the contour of the circle pretty closely. It may come a little bit inside. And then we'll measure our boxes and come down by the same measurement. That seems a little too long. Let's do a little check here. Okay, and there we go. That makes more sense. Measuring is useful. Okay. So we can then drop the side of the head and drop the jaw. And we're really, again, we're in a more observant space now because we're looking at a specific person. So I know that the shape of his jaw doesn't look like this. So this is, an opportunity for me to say, okay, well, I know that he's smiling. So his cheek is kind of coming out a little bit to the side. His jaw comes in a little bit more like this. So I can go ahead and start customizing the formula to this specific head, even at this stage. I'll create my little contour here, and we can see a little bit of the contour on this side, probably just because of the fact that he's turned quite a bit towards us. It's not an extreme angle. We can come down for the neck. Okay, and now we'll start in with the features. So we know the brow line is approximately right here. It looks like we're not really seeing, I know it's covered in hair, so we're kind of guessing a little bit about the outside of that forehead, and maybe on this cheek too. It might need to come in just a little bit. So we're now combining our observation with our knowledge of the formula and of the anatomy. We can sketch in the shapes. The other helpful thing about kind of sketching in at least the indications of the eye socket is that it kind of brackets the bridge of the nose for you. We know that the bottom of the nose is going to be approximately right here. Create a center line down through the chin. The mouth is probably about right there, maybe a little bit lower. No, I think it's good. And he's got a lot of expression in the eyeballs, so we're not going to see very much of them at all, but we know they're in there. They're just a little deeper behind all the, the smile creases. So we can kind of sketch them in, make sure we have at least some parameters for how they're going to fit onto the face. I'm also going to, now we're not going into like all of the features and all the ways they change and all the different tilts and angles and directions. But you will notice that when the head is tilted more up, we're going to see more of the underplane of the nose. When a head is tilted more down, we would see more. I mean, you can see it on me right now. If I tilt my head down, you see like the top of my nose, and the nose itself, you're really seeing the kind of like this shape. This is the ball of the nose. The nostrils are kind of underneath the shape of the nose. Whereas in this case, he's looking up. So we're going to see kind of the underplane of the nose. We're going to see the nostrils, all that good stuff. So really, like, this is where the nose meets the face, but I might sketch in kind of like this sort of shape to indicate that whole bottom plane of the nose, maybe sketch in the ball of the nose and a little bit of information here so that I can see that three-dimensional form. We can start in on the eyes, kind of following these wrinkles, using them as a guide. Same on this side. We're going to look for, we're always checking distances against anything else that we can see. So another benefit of this formula is that essentially it's creating a whole lot of reference points for you without, because the blank page can be really intimidating because you're trying to figure out where to begin with this very complicated subject, and having some sort of framework just to get you off the ground. And then you can always use that framework to look for, okay, well, now that I have a line for where the nose is, I can check and look for how the other features are related to that, how they fit together and things like that. So once we have anything on the page, everything suddenly becomes a little bit easier. And the more things you can get down that you're fairly confident about, the easier it gets. Put in a little bit of some indications of these curls. And we also know that the hair is probably coming up quite a bit higher than the edge of the head here, because I think the top of his head is probably right around where we're actually seeing the hairline. Just like in the formula, we saw how the hairline and the top of the head are pretty much aligned with one another. Sometimes just placing the volume of the head also helps to make sense of what you're seeing, since we really don't see people as bald most of the time. If they have hair, we're actually reading that hair as part of the shape of their head. All right, and we're still going to use our kind of like midway through the eye markers, just very lightly place those in. Since he's smiling, that does change the features a little bit, but he's not full teeth smiling, so we can kind of work with the kind of standard measurements and make small adjustments if we need to. We see a little bit of the upper lip and lower lip, and then lots of mustache. So I'm going to put in these nostrils here, and then I'm just going to kind of loosely sketch in the shape of the mustache. Shape of the little kind of patch of beard right there under the bottom lip. Sketching in the shapes of the rest of this beard. It's a very kind of messy scruff beard, so we don't have to be super precise. And again, most of these marks that we're making at this stage in the drawing are notes to ourselves. These are things that, when we're ready to continue with the drawing, if we were going to like finish it or paint it, we would want these notes so that we know where things are going. But they're not perfect representations of exactly what we're going for. They're more like, again, just notes to yourself. We can really see this kind of like prominent shape on the chin here, though. Like I said, the chin is kind of like a little bit of a box that's kind of sitting on the front of the jaw there. And I'm going to also kind of adjust the shape of the side of his head a little bit. Now that we have more information, I think we can check in with what's going on over here. We've got these kind of forms of the cheek. You could sketch in as kind of circles. There's a rhythm of the face that kind of, there's another, I think, John Riley, I believe, is another method for drawing the face that follows these sorts of rhythms, which are really interesting, but it's a little bit harder to get started with, in my opinion. But it's worth looking into if you're really interested in this type of artwork. All right, so that's the beginning of this portrait. And of course, we could go on and really clean it up and make sure that our likeness is solid. I can see a few places where it's probably a little bit off, but let's continue anyway. We won't erase, we'll just move him out of the way for now. And let's do this one next. We have time for probably a couple more before the questions. Just to check in, Bobby, you said the questions, is it until 5:30 demo and then questions, or do you want to get the questions in before 5:30?
Well, usually we end around 5:30.
Okay.
So if you want
we can start doing
know,
questions soon.
Yeah, I'm fascinated.
Okay, great.
This is amazing.
Oh, great. Awesome. Well, I'm going to do one more then, and then we'll go to questions. We'll do this one. All right. So we're going to start the same way with a circle. And once again, if you want to kind of check in with your reference, I think it's always helpful to do a little bit of like sitting with it before you start drawing. I also teach my students something I call rapid learning reps, which is just the idea that like before you sit down to do any sort of portrait drawing, especially because portraits and getting a real likeness is difficult, is to just do a couple of really short, like set a timer for like 3 to 5 minutes. So really, really short, just loose sketches, just to get familiar with the face, just to get comfortable with like, how's the angle, like what are things doing? Because I think having that familiarity and just kind of running through the practice a few times in a very quick succession, short amount of time is such an incredible learning tool. It really kind of speeds you through some of those difficult problems that come up with portrait drawing. So same thing, we can kind of look at the shape of the center line. In this one, I want to point out that like the jaw is definitely more forward. It does kind of come back to the same. So if we were looking at a profile of her, the forehead might be here. It's going to kind of come out and then maybe go back a little bit for the chin. So it's kind of like a low belly curve there. And the eyebrow line and the ear line show us that she's kind of angled up and tilted a little bit. So we have both of those turns. And if it helps you, like, especially if you have your photo reference somewhere where you actually can draw on it and like have that as a reference, sometimes leaving those lines up is useful too. So you don't have to like erase them if you need them or want to use them. So we're going to draw our center line, trying to match the angle here. And then our brow line, same deal, try to match the angle as much as you can. And again, we can kind of look for like where that turn of planes is happening on her face. It should be like right at the outside of the eyebrows. So we can look at like how big that looks on her face and then try to mimic about that size. And we want to match the center line angle as well. So it should follow the same curve, just a little bit tighter because it's toward the edge of the circle. Then we straighten out this line. We drop a perpendicular line and shave off a little bit of the other side. And then we'll match the curve or the angle of that line. We'll follow that around the circle. This feels like the center line might be a little bit low. I'm just going to kind of nudge it up a little. We can adjust these shapes until they really feel like they match. So you don't have to try to race through it. You can really, take your time, make sure it feels right. Okay, and then I'm going to do my little measurements on another layer here so I can really check them. Yeah, and but we're really seeing it more at that angle. That feels a little too long. Let me double check again. Okay, so that one might need to come up a bit, and then yeah, there we go. That makes more sense. Okay. Always double check yourself, even if you think you know what you're doing. Okay. So then we're going to follow a little bit of the contours of her face here as I try to match what I'm drawing with what I'm seeing. Her face feels a little wide to me. It might need to kind of slim down a little, but again, this is, we can continue to make adjustments as we go, but. And now I'm sort of following the center line. I'm moving the center line according to what I observed over here. So instead of just dropping it straight down, I'm going to try to follow what I observe in the reference photo. So if I know that the jaw is a little bit further forward or the lips are a little bit further forward, I'm going to try to adjust my center line to accommodate for that so that I don't get thrown off by that later. Okay, now using our brow line, sketch in some eyebrows. Look for the shape of the eye socket here. Should be about right there. We can do kind of the same over here again, just bracket ourselves into a nice confined space for the eye. And then we make kind of an, educated guess. You can measure if you want to be really careful about the size of the eyes. Again, there should be 5 eyes from one side of the head to the other side of the head, 1 between them, 2 eyes, and then 1 on either side. But that goes past the hairline a little bit. So for instance, if you're looking at me right now, I might not have a full eyes width on either side, but if you kind of, if I were bald, you'd probably see it. Okay, and then just sketching in the features loosely based on what we know. When you make your lines down from the middle of the eyes, you always want to be paying attention to the angle of the head. If I were to try to drop this line down straight, that obviously wouldn't help me very much. So we want to follow the angle of this line here when we're making those lines. Shadow for the chin, goes around. We've got lots of deep shadows on this side of her face. And in her case, I feel like the ear is a little bit further back. Everybody's ears kind of, some of them kind of angle a little more backwards or forwards. And then we have a lot of hair back here. We can just kind of sketch in the shape for the hair loosely. Again, we'll pay attention to kind of where the hairline like how far away it is from the other features, everything. We're always wanting to relate back to something else, so we have some sort of reference point. We're not just guessing wildly. Got some kind of bun going on up here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and start kind of cleaning up this sketch, but while I'm doing so, I'm going to open it up to questions. So if you guys have any questions, go ahead and ask them now. I'm just going to kind of start covering this with a little bit more polished of a sketch while we're taking them. So feel free to jump in with any questions you have.
So if you'd like to unmute yourself to ask, it might be easier than typing, because I want to watch instead of watching what I type. So
yeah, either way is fine with me. I've got my eyes on the chat, so if you put one in there, I should see it. And, you know, if you unmute yourself and say something, I'll definitely hear you.
Excuse me. Can you tell me again, how do you measure the flat side of the head from the middle line?
Sure. Yeah. So the idea is that it's going to be 2/3. The circle that you're drawing is 2/3 the size of the circle that you've drawn for the full size of the head. But obviously, depending on the angle, that can be a little bit difficult to measure. So the metric that I usually use, especially when I'm drawing from a photo, is just to look at the photo and kind of observe like where the plane shift is happening. Like if you can kind of visualize like this being the front of the face and this being the side of the head, like where does that break? And it's usually right around the edges of the eyebrows. So if you can do that, and then you basically kind of like draw an ellipse that takes you to the back of the head, that helps to visualize it. And once you've practiced it a handful of times and you're really like you've done it on a, you know, you can trace over photos and do this like kind of on top of a photo a few times. And that really helps to kind of make sense of how it meshes with a real person. Because sometimes the abstract is difficult to grasp until you're really seeing it like in application. So one thing I have my students do sometimes is like print off the photo, or if you're working digitally, you know, bring it into your document and just draw like the formula right on top of the photo, so you can really see how it's like changing for different people, how it's shifting for the different angles. Because most people will be pretty close to the formula, but there are always small, tiny little deviations in little places. So it's helpful just to kind of have like a little bit of a catalog of that in your head of how things might shift around. But the idea is that the ellipse is usually from kind of the corner of the eyebrows to the back of the head. And it's about 2/3 the size as a circle of your original circle.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Anybody else?
I'm going to read one now. It says, Rebecca, thanks again for your efforts. When a face has a strong expression like surprise, do the baselines change? And how do you bring up the expression?
That's a great question. It does change things a little bit, kind of depending on the expression. I mean, if you're looking at me and I'm just kind of like straight faced, everything should line up pretty similarly. But if I, you know, really express really big, you know, my eyebrows might move up, my mouth is going to appear bigger. So there are some adjustments that happen when you're dealing with like a really expressive face. So you can still kind of use a version of the formula. You just have to know that you're going to end up kind of morphing it a little bit more, or having to make some more adjustments to it. And I usually just, I mean, personally, I'm not like a comic animator, so I'm not trying to come up with these expressions out of my head. I'm usually looking at a reference photo. And so the benefit of having a reference photo is that you're going to kind of look at where things deviate, and you're basically just going to be comparing everything against everything else. So like if she were smiling really wide, her mouth might appear a little bit wider, and I could find that width by just comparing it with her eyes again. So maybe instead of being right in the middle of her eyes, it's like towards the outer edge of the eye, and I would just look around the photo for anything that I can compare that that shape to, or reference for that shape. So, you know, like look at the distance between the edge of the face or the edge of the mouth and the nearest edge that's on the face, or, you know, down from the eye, or anything else that you can compare to that's going to help you kind of get additional reference points. Obviously, your eyeballs themselves aren't really going to move around, so those will stay pretty standard. You can still usually see some indication of the actual eye socket, the brow bone, that can help you kind of locate, like if the eyebrows are really far up, you might be able to kind of see the top of the eye socket and kind of use that as a marker, and just know that the eyebrows are going to be a little bit higher. So this is another opportunity to kind of play around with, even like drawing on top of your photo or doing some type of analysis of the photo using the formula as a reference point. So you know that if this, you know, big expression is changing some things, using the formula can still be helpful, because it can give you a reference point for, like, this is what it would look like normally, and then if I'm going to make these adjustments to give this expression more life, then like here's how it differs from those normal placements. Does that make sense?
Do you also, this is Bobby asking, do you also,
Okay.
when you're painting, you know, we're seeing the sketching, do you also do demos or classes with painting and mixing all the skin tones and everything involved?
I do some. I'm working on a longer course on oil painting portraits. Right now I have a ProCreate portraits course that goes into color. My my regular, like my first course was a pencil drawing course, so we didn't do color mixing there. I do have a sort of intro to oil painting course right now that does talk about mixing colors, but it's not specifically about flesh tones. So that's something that's on my agenda. I'm hoping to have it out later this year, maybe around Christmas. Because I
Rebecca,
do really love
uh,
working with skin tones. Oh, go ahead.
excuse me. Um, I notice I have a problem when I do portraits. I took your first course, and I had been working on my kid. And sometimes when he's laughing and I'm trying to do his portrait, it almost looks like he's crying. And I don't
Yeah.
really know how to capture that happy, glowing. Um, I don't know if you can see it, like,
Yeah. That's challenging because the two expressions are like weirdly similar. Sometimes
Right.
happiness can look a little bit like pain if there's a little bit of something is off. A lot of it has to do with the eyes in particular, because like this area is going to be kind of like a grimace, and a smile can be very, very similar. Sometimes it's just like a little bit in the corners of the mouth, like the way they're pulling either slightly up or slightly down will be an indicator, but the eyes is also a really important place to focus on because that's where we read a lot of expression. So sometimes if you're trying to draw a smiling face and maybe the eyes are like a little bit too open or a little bit too closed, it can like very quickly become a grimace.
yeah.
So I would definitely suggest being like very, very precise with your measuring, and maybe doing some RLRs beforehand too, those rapid learning sketches where you kind of like experiment with slight changes you can make in how you're trying to capture the expression. Might reveal some things to you, because sometimes it's just a matter of practice. Like we just don't have complete control over the medium immediately, and it just takes a little bit of practice, a little bit of repetition to get to where we are like really understanding what's making the differences in our drawing versus in what we're trying to achieve. So off the top of my head, I don't have like a list of like particular steps you can take, but I would say really, really pay a lot of attention to the eyes. And you can, again, like use anything that you can compare to around the eyes to help you figure out like how tall, how open are the eyes? How much of the iris am I seeing? Am I seeing like, is it, really tightly closed and I'm just seeing like a little bit of iris kind of peeking through? Is it, and even like which direction is it closed in? Is there more bulk on this side of the eye which might be like the inside of the eye, or is there more bulk on the outer side of the eye? Because that can change the expression too. If I have like this looks kind of like a happy eye, maybe it has like a little smile wrinkle, gonna have a little bit of that underneath. But an angry eye, the eyebrow might be like slightly lower. The eye itself might kind of be a little, we might have more bulk on the outside instead of the inside, because that brow is going to kind of push this down a little bit.
Oh, that makes
So
sense.
it might be like very similar, but just those slight changes can completely change the expression. So we have to be like really extra observant when we're dealing with those like kind of big expressions.
Yeah, no smiley faces for me for a while.
Start simple, work your way there.
I just want to thank you very much for taking your course. The group of people was so supportive and so amazing, and
I'm so glad
so
to hear that.
empowering. Like I wish the world would be like this. I just love you and the group and everything, and thank you. I'll be quiet now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I try to, I wish the world were more like that too. That's why I try to make my little corner of it as nice as I can.
I had a question.
Okay.
I was wondering, lots of the dimensions you mentioned are easy to do, but sometimes I'll have problems with the distance between the eye, the corner of the eye, and the ear. Especially from a profile, because that's you don't have any hard measurements there.
Right. It's kind of just a big blank space there.
Right. How would you suggest to do that with a different method besides your sphere? I mean, just to visually capture that, make sure that distance is broad enough.
Well, let me turn back on the profile one here. So with the Loomis method, the biggest or the most helpful metric is this little kind of line right here, which is just, even if you draw it perfectly straight, to connect this axis with kind of like the lowest point of the chin, which is usually not the front point, but like maybe a little bit back. This line should give you like the absolute outer limit of where the corner of the eye can be. And this line down the center is going to help you make sure that the ear is far enough back. So the ear shouldn't be in front of this line. Can you see that okay? I've got like a bunch of stuff turned on.
Yeah, there's different layers, but I can see.
There we go. So this should, it kind of just gives you some brackets. So it might not be exact for a specific person, but it does give you at least some way of like separating those things and knowing like this shouldn't go any, like, if the eye's like back here, we know that's too far back. If the eye's like all the way up here, we know that's probably too far forward. And same with the ear, like if it's, up here, that's too close. If it's all the way back here, that's too far. So these just gives you like some parameters to kind of bracket yourself in the right place. And then what you're going to really look for is like, especially if there's a hairline to follow, that's going to be the next thing that you can use to help kind of give yourself some parameters there. Most of the time, we're going to see the hairline kind of come like this, maybe go back a little bit, something along these lines. And this distance is one that like, I think we get messed up a lot, mostly because we're just not really paying that much attention to it. We think like, because it's very simple and because there's a lot of space there, we don't pay quite as much attention to it as we probably should, to locate exactly like how far is it from the corner of the eyebrow, how far is it from the front of the ear, like anything you can use. And in the hair itself might be a few details you can use, like maybe the hair is kind of like swooping back and you know that you're going to have room for those shapes. So if you can't fit them the same way you see them, then you know that something needs to move around as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I don't usually put in that one diagonal line from the eyebrow to the chin. And
I think that's a real key for helping out with that. Yeah.
And I just wanted to make one comment between the crying and the laughing, just an observation. Is that lots of times when you're laughing, the face is more relaxed. So the lines are less
a little bit
harsh.
softer.
But when you're crying, it's a lot more contracted and more tense. So I would imagine the lines be a lot stronger. That's just a comment.
Right. Yeah. That's sometimes you can definitely, especially in like, either like really young or really old faces, where like children make like really extreme expressions. And then as we age, we get more wrinkles. So they just like show up a little more. But yeah, it's sometimes the tension is what we're seeing, and that's just hard to put a name to. But it does usually kind of like make things a little sharper. Yeah, good comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we're at 5:30. If there are any other questions, get them in.
Last call for questions.
Last call. Well, we've just really appreciated this, Rebecca. And you can
Thank you
see
so
in
much for
chat-
having me.
You're welcome. Thank you. You can see in chat, we have Rebecca's website, rtyart.com. And you can find out more about Rebecca and the Loomis Method and the different courses that she offers to help us out. I'm not as afraid of portraits as I used to be. So thank you. Sorry, this is Bobby speaking. And I just really appreciate seeing this, breaking it down and the practice and drawing over the extra papers that you're using, the sources for the portraits. So thank you. Anybody else
Awesome.
before
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, or unmute to say goodbye. This is your chance. Thank you. Thank you. You see hands.
Thank you.
I see
Thank
some
you.
hands. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Very good.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. I'm going to end the video. So thanks so much, Rebecca.
All right. Awesome. Have a good one, everybody.
Hi, Machi.